to start off with a comment we received that I think it's very nice to share. One of our comments on YouTube from Cynthia, she said, after listening to the speakers today and Michael right now, I finally get the rising and awakening of the Kundalini. My experience is not a curse. I was resistant and now grateful and humbled. Great job, guys. Let's go to JJ Semple. Sophia asked during your talk, if Kundalini is the next step in human evolution, why does society know so little about it?
That's a good question. I think the problem it arises with what I was hinting at during the presentation, and that is just the word Kundalini. It's a scary term, and it's a loaded term, and loaded in so many different directions that nobody gets a clear picture of what it is and what it's about when it's mentioned. Is it a cult? Is it some kind of demonic power? Is it a force for good? Is it a force for evil? Take a topic like meditation. Instantly, you get a mental picture of what meditation is. You visualize somebody sitting and meditating. Mindfulness, almost the same way. But Kundalini, it's scary. It's worth delving into. It's cult. I think, and I know this probably a little upset people, but I think we need to come up with a better, more universal term to denote Kundalini, one that isn't as scary or as ambiguous in so many different ways.
Thank you, JJ. So let's go back to Michael. Dalius asked, how did you come to the conclusion that the universal consciousness is finite?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that I came to the conclusion that the universal consciousness is finite. I guess we have to look at it from the perspective that there is the infinite consciousness, which is beyond anything we can even really conceive of. It's all knowing. It's really has all information, all knowledge. There is a kind of a separation that goes on as a consequence of Maya Shakti, where the individual spark of that consciousness is isolated in the human being. We cannot perceive things in an infinite way. We can only perceive things in a finite way. Therefore, even though reality itself in its ultimate form may be infinite, we at our current level of evolution are blocked from that perception. Now, in the state of enlightenment, there is a much closer connection with that universal consciousness. So we perceive it directly. It is something that I remember Gopi Krishna would say. When he perceived that consciousness, he said, "I am humbled to dust." It is so vast. It is so far beyond anything in the way of human consciousness. So we use the terms finite and infinite because, as I said in my presentation, we think in dualistic terms. Our brains are not wired to think in absolute terms. Our brains are wired to think in dualistic terms. So the infinite is the infinite, but our perception of it, our understanding of it, we can think of it in a dualistic sense, that there is the static and the dynamic, the infinite and the finite, the passive and the active, and so on. So it is just a matter of the way our brains are wired, the way our perceptive faculties work, that we need to think in those terms. But it's just a consequence of that, not that the infinite is finite. The infinite is infinite. There's only one infinite. There's only one universality. But it's our brains that require us to understand it in a different way. So I hope that answers your question.
Next question we have for Corinne. During your talk, Sophia asked, how can we bring this awareness to people if when I begin sharing my own experiences, people act as if they were asleep?
I really understand that. It's almost as though, unless you've experienced Kundalini, trying to explain it to someone, it's intangible. It's not something that they can receive. grasp. So in the sense of having a knowing and understanding what it's like, a way I've found to talk to people about what's going on is to just start out with saying something like, I feel energy around my body, like, like, you know, when you rub your hands together and then you can sort of feel energy between it. So people can relate to that, and that's sort of like an opening and a little bit of a springboard. But yeah, I still find it the exact same problem, like trying to explain to people, you know, Kundalini is really important. It's an evolutionary process. We're spiritually awakening. And some people, they just actually cannot even hear those words. So that's a really good question that actually I'd love to pose to the group, even like the Emerging Science Foundation group, and then anyone else as well. You know, what are some good solutions to find ways to explain what this is all about and why it's so important? Because I know myself, I haven't found a solution for that.
I found a solution for it, and that is not talking about it to people that are unable to comprehend it.
There you go.
In the early 70s, when my Kundalini activated, I was so eager. I mean, this was such a momentous event, and I was so eager and so naive and so willing that I would talk to people, and the screen would lower, and I just finally realized that it wasn't worth it, that they've got to come to you. You know what, if you build it, they will come, something like that. Or
part of it is, as JJ said, but several of us today have talked about the idea that it's a universal energy. The Kundalini is just one name for it. That Kundalini is not a process. Kundalini is not a stuff in the sense that it's something separate. It is just another name for spiritually transformative energy. And really interestingly, is about 10 years ago, a huge study was sponsored by someplace like Reader's Digest or something. I'd have to look up what it, but some kind of mainstream organization or publication. And they did this huge study, and they found that 1/3 of people in the United States actually would say, when they were asked on this study, have you ever had a mystical experience? And they said yes. Now, they defined it differently, and maybe that for them it just meant a dream that they'd had one night that turned out to be prophetic, or a sensation that they'd had that something was going to happen and then it happened, or you know, a spontaneous thing of creativity that they'd had. So people really identified this idea of something kind of mystical, that experience that was beyond the ordinary, the extraordinary, something. The word extraordinary is just good too, because it's extra, it's beyond the ordinary. So maybe sometimes when we talk about it like that, I mean, I've had the same problem as everybody here when I try to talk about my profound spiritual experiences, no matter what you call them. You know, you seem a little new age flaky, but this idea of thinking about it is universal, and using universal terms, whatever your religion is, whatever the culture you're around, try to find some way in your religion or your culture that term of experiencing beyond and a direct experience of the divine is talked about it, and use those terms to that person. So that's helped me a little.
Thank you, Teri.
I had a mystical experience. I imagined that Donald Trump was elected president.
So just to
on to the next topic.
a little
Hate to break it to you.
to go back to that question, the other thing that I have found really does help, and it kind of throws people off too who don't understand, is if you take their angle in their view of things, if you try to imagine how they think and what they believe, and starting from there to try to begin to explain your own experience. So someone asked JJ, Light Travel actually asked, how does the method of the golden flower differ from the Indian yoga methods?
Yeah, good question. It's derived from the Chinese path, And just like everybody, just about everybody in their presentations drew parallels between the various paths. I don't think, I don't know enough about Indian meditation, but all I do know that the Golden Flower meditation has 3 steps, and that is diaphragmatic deep breathing, control of heart rate, and the backward flowing method. The last being the key ingredient to igniting Kundalini, and that is when you detect a sensation of energy in the lower belly. That's where I did. I mean, anatomically, it's very difficult to pin it down, but I can only speak from my experience, and that is at a point during the meditation, I began to have sensations. In other words, first you sit there and you meditate and seemingly nothing happens, and you say, what is this? This is a waste of time. You go through all those different changes. Well, for me, finally, I started to detect centers of energy, and they occurred first in the lower belly. And when that happened, something triggered in me and I remembered the words backward flowing method in The Secret of the Golden Flower. I had read it 100 times. I was working with a book over a year in a solitary situation. And all of a sudden I realized that, oh, I think I can reverse that energy. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's what that means, the backward flowing method. And I was able, through just a mental operation, to order this energy. First it was going down the back and up the front, and I ordered it to change directions, and that's what kicked off what I call the sexual sublimation, and Gopi Krishna called it that too, the sexual sublimation process. Now, I don't think the methods that, like I said, Herbert Benson imported the first 2 steps of the method, because it's pretty scary to think that an entire just average person studying meditation, and you'd start to try to explain to them the backward flowing method, and the consequences that might lead to. I don't know if does that answer the question?
We hope so. Let's move on to, thank you, by the way. Question for Carl. So 11-minute Meza asked, do you have further resources regarding the human heart and the 9th wave frequency? I practice heart math, which puts 0.1 hertz as a resonant frequency. Thank you.
Well, I think what the activation of the 9th wave, which only then happened a couple of years ago, meant was that the predominating effect of the dualistic mind is deactivated through that, and in its place, you might say, comes a heart resonance. That's just another language for what I'm saying. When I talk about the 9th wave and following the 9th wave, we're talking about, in fact, a very low frequency, even though it's the highest of the creation waves. So it's basically a wave period is 36 days long. And so it's something you'll have to follow over time in order to self-correct and develop your resonance with this wave in such a way that you open your heart. And it's really about I would say decoupling or disengaging the mind, I would say, because the mind, as I showed, it comes out of duality, and it's not something that comes from us really. It's something that our brains have downloaded. It's not because our brains are wired in a specific way that we are thinking in dualistic terms. The reason we have been used to thinking in dualistic terms is that we downloaded a dualist mind, and now the chance is there to instead develop resonance with unity consciousness or the heart, which is the sort of the coherent expression of unity consciousness.
Thank you so much, Carl. Another question for you, which is from me, that I'm really curious for you to answer is, if we are entering a dark wave, yet we have access now to this ninth wave, which brings divine unity, how will this dark wave that we're entering look like?
Yeah, it's a good question, you know, and I think most people or everyone here probably realizes the great importance of intention, but the intention to sort of lift ourselves from the resonance with that particular duality of the mind that the sixth wave has brought. And based on that, you know, we can use different languages and so forth, but based on that intention of listening to our hearts, based on that intention to create resonance with the ninth wave, then we can lift ourselves above the kind of dark age phenomena that is coming on a lower level of the creation spectrum of waves. So I think it's designed this way. It's obviously designed this way, the evolution of the cosmos. But it's not designed in such a way that we do not have to choose or we don't have to intend. We really do have to do that, and that's becoming much more. But it's wonderful, you know, that people like you are organizing this kind of a webinar because it gives the very knowledge that there is such a path to unity consciousness, or the kind of enlightenment that Kundalini energy gives rise to. That very knowledge is crucial and wonderful and crucial, both things for people at this particular time. Because if they don't, you know, there is a risk, you know, I can say that because it should be obvious to everyone that, you know, the world and maybe especially the United States is sort of slipping down into all kinds of conflicts and fights and so forth, because people just don't have the big perspective of things. And if we can provide some perspective and provide the insight that evolution has a goal, and there are tools that we may acquire to fulfill that particular destiny, then we're really doing something good. And I thank you for again for having set up this wonderful group of speakers for this.
Thank you, Carl. One more question for you. Lawrence asked, the Mayan calendar had the ninth wave starting in 2011. Was there a world event or historical that marked the ascent of this wave?
Well, you know, if you think about it, the wave was activated March 9th, 2011, and 2 days after that, March 11th, you had the biggest earthquake in our lifetimes, the Fukushima tsunami and so forth. And I think it actually is, you know, there is a small restructuring on the level of the earth that happens. But you should also think that during that whole year, you really saw how people became attracted to thoughts of unity. This is the time of the Arab Spring. This is the time of the Occupy movement, and all these kind of things. A completely new way of thinking were brought into politics as a result of the activation of this wave. And it's not surprising, because if you look at the different polarities of the mind, what the ninth wave means is that the filters, the veils are being removed, and people can see clearly. And what happened in that particular time, you know, for the first 300 days or something like that, was that people started to see clearly how inconsistent our world is with the golden age, how inconsistent our world is with unity and equality and respect for every human being. And so it was very, very clear. You know, I could go into why this kind of a mentality didn't last. I do it in my forthcoming book, but the immediate change that the activation of this wave was not only the sort of the, what you might say, the destructive effect of the slight recalibration of the earth that was necessary, but it was also a change in mentality that swept the world in 2011. You know, when the year ended, Time magazine, that always appoints a person of the year, they said we can't point out any particular person for this year, but there's been so many protests against the established order all over the world that we have the person of the year will be the protester. And there was a protest of an order of duality that have dominated people for 5,000 years. And you know, I won't go into detail why this change didn't last, but you know, we're talking about transcending an order of the world that has lasted for 5,000 years, and so it's not something that happens overnight. But it does happen because of people like you. If you uphold the intention of creating a world where relationships are based on unity and love.
Wonderful. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Carl. I have a question here for Teri Degler. Donna asked, I would like to ask of the differences between holding Kundalini on an intellectual level, the head, or holding in heart, spirit, and to combine both in balance.
Oh, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, Donna. One of the things I really wanted to emphasize more was this idea of Kundalini, or transformative spiritual energy, whatever we want to call it, being in the body. And that's one of the great things we learn from these yoga scriptures, is they talk about the body being the container for this, that we actually have the divine cosmic energy. We have a spark of it within, and we can activate it more. So one of the ways we can activate it and is through yoga. That's what Hatha yoga was about, the postures, but also pranayama, the breathing exercises, are ways of, especially of gradually, if you don't overdo it, don't get extreme, but gradually helping awaken it. So your question is about holding it in the mind or holding it in the heart. I would say essentially we hold it in the body. And then as we do these exercises like pranayama, which is just basic breathing exercise, and we can sense the idea that prana shakti, which is the other word for prana, like Kundalini Shakti, it's life energy, as Michael Bradford explains so well, that energy begins to move through our bodies, and we can actually sense it in our hearts and moving up gradually and transforming our minds, so that we don't think of it so much as this dichotomy of spirit being here, heart being here, but we think of ourselves as a container that is already one with everything. And what we're doing is, in this method, we're really just recognizing our oneness with the divine. It's another way of recognizing our oneness with the divine, and that we are, each one of us, a container for the divine. And we can feel it through just gentle breathing exercises. I have a lot of them on my website. They're in my books. They're just basic yogic pranayama where we actually see this divine, white, radiant prana that exists, life energy that Mike talked about, existing everywhere, existing within us, without of us, part of us, in us, out of us, and rising up, becoming more intensive in us. So thank you. Thank you for that question.
Amazing. Great. So we have a question here for Michael Molina. David Perry asked, after 20 plus years of experiencing an altered state while raising Kundalini, has there been any functional MRI studies that reveal brain imaging under Kundalini?
None that I know of. I don't think that Kundalini as a phenomenon has been researched very widely, really at all. To my knowledge, the work that we're doing at the Emerging Sciences Foundation is really, and also there's been some studies from the Kundalini Research Institute, but none that focus on Kundalini as such a transformative force that's capable of elevating human consciousness to higher consciousness.
Thank you so much. The next question here is one for you again, Michael. Does any of the speakers seek to sustain samadhi on a constant, or have they accepted that this has only happened once? And I believe this was Donna. She was assuming that they have only activated once.
Yeah, so I can start and then maybe open it up to the group. But after my initial experience with Kundalini and Kundalini awakening, really the goal of my life has been to elevate myself in such a way where this experience can come more easily to me. I often tell my two sons who are young, I say, if you do nothing else in this world, the one greatest wish that I have for you is for you to even get a glimpse, just even a fleeting glimpse of what this experience might be like, because it is so important and so transformative. And I think as a Kundalini researcher, the goal really should be not just to investigate Kundalini empirically, using science and statistics, but really to turn oneself into the lab and make oneself the subject of your own experimentation. Cultivate yourself, evolve yourself, develop the techniques and methods and frame of mind that you need in your life to become a living embodiment of this Kundalini energy. And I think when more researchers actually start doing that, we're going to see this transformation happen in scientific circles, where it's no longer me as the observer, and then I have the subject out here. It's all going to become the same thing, where the researcher now says, in order for me to understand Kundalini, in order for me to understand this process of spiritual transformation, I myself need to awaken. I myself need to experience this firsthand, so that I can talk in an intelligent way, in an informed way about spiritual experience in general. And I think until that happens, science will continue to be in sort of the rut that it's in now, where if you look at the research that's going on, no one has a clear idea of the directionality of spiritual evolution. There's so many different views out there, but when more people, more scientists and researchers start adopting methods to awaken Kundalini and experience it themselves, then you'll see this revolution occur.
Thank you so much.
You see this in examples of, and I forget the individuals, but there have been a number of books written by famous people, doctors. There's one, I think he was a heart specialist who had a heart attack or a stroke, and all of a sudden his consciousness shifted from the left brain went totally dead, and he went into the right brain, which didn't know how to dial a phone or balance a checkbook, but knew DNA, knew that all-encompassing state of consciousness. And so you see these people that are very, very skeptical until this happens to them, and then it's not just a question of believing, they are in it, just like Michael said. They had become one with it, and then they're able to write a book, and books like that influence lots of people because it's getting from just the purely physical plane to a much greater super consciousness plane?
I would like to answer that question as well, or speak to it. I've been very, very blessed, and actually hearing the question has brought tears to my eyes at how much I take it for granted. I've had this experience of going into a bliss state several different times in my life. It hasn't just been once. And what happens is it's an elevated state where kind of everything makes sense, and then something will knock me off and I'm back into, I call it the three-dimensional world. And it's sometimes there is no formula as to why it goes back and forth. But I can say that every time that it does slip back into that state of being, there is even more love, more bliss, and sometimes it has even been hard to function in the world. It's like feeling so much bliss coming through. And so it hasn't just been a one-time thing. And what I've learned about this in the process is that to not get down on myself when it goes away, because it will come back. I imagine if I lived on a mountain top in the Himalayas, I might be able to stay in it. But it's an experience that expands over time, and the door is open. The door is wide open. And I say I've realized I've taken that wide open door for granted because of the struggle of what I feel like. I know what it feels like to be there, and I want to get back to that. But when I fall back into, let's call it the three-dimensional world, sometimes I even forget how to get there. It's such a vast difference in perception in the world. So it isn't just a one-time thing. It continues to evolve, at least for me. And I've read some other accounts where it's been that way for some people. So I just wanted to share that.
But having experienced that, and you have something akin to a spiritual version of muscle memory that allows you to go back to it, whereas somebody that hasn't experienced it has to work more on it in perhaps many different ways. But once you've had it, you know it's there, and nothing can take that away from you, that realization.
Beautiful. We have 2 more questions, and we are running overtime, as the theme of today is. So we're going to go ahead and ask Bradford a question. Bala asks, when I had an intense awakening and oneness experience, I had a state of mind where I was extremely afraid of unknown. Could you please explain how the finite human being with limitations can handle the process?
That is an excellent question. And I think that where I see where there's sort of a need for understanding is in the depth of transformation that goes on before the human brain can manifest this higher state of consciousness. Many people have mystical experiences. They have glimpses that go on for seconds, minutes, hours, maybe even longer. But everybody, for the most part, comes back to a normal state of consciousness. In the case of Gopi Krishna, he had his initial awakening when he was 34 years old. And over the next 12 years, Kundalini was highly active in his body. He talks in his autobiography about waking up in the middle of the night, and he would perceive this storm of activity going on in his body, in his brain, the nervous system, the internal organs. And it took 12 years of that intense process. And then after the 12 years, there was a major shift. And instead of having, as many people do, or most people do, this glimpse, these occasional glimpses of higher consciousness, he actually entered a state where he was able to shift into it at will. We would be sitting there at dinner, and he would just close his eyes and go off. And, he would just, all of a sudden, I think the way he described it was, the universe would just melt away into consciousness. It would just dissolve from the physical, and there would be this unimaginably vast intelligence there instead. And he had to be a bit careful of it, because if he got too immersed in it, then it would it had some health effects that were difficult. He would get burned out, so he had to be very disciplined about it. But it took 12 years of this intense process. And I guess when I was talking about how our brains are wired to perceive in a finite way, in a dualistic way, in his case, this rewiring that went on in the brain, this 12 years of constant change and rewiring, that literally changed the structure of the brain so that instead of just having a glimpse of the the infinite for a few minutes, that he was able to call on it at will, to merge into it whenever he felt like it. And I think the depths of the transformation is something that, depending on where we're starting from, there are some people, for instance, some of the mystics, maybe like Adi Shankaracharya, virtually born into this state. And eventually the whole human race will be born into this state in the same way that the whole human race is born with an intellect, although lately I'm beginning to wonder. But this will be a feature of the human race that we have as a part of our makeup. But it is a very profound transformation, and it is not something that, and this is where, in our Western society, we want something right away. We think, well, if I do yoga for a few weeks or a few months, then, I can become enlightened. But this is a transformation that goes way beyond that. If I said to you, well, do you think that you could meditate for a few months and then, say, become a concert musician? You would go, well, obviously not. Well, this is a transformation that is even way beyond that. So it's something that, for a person who is trying to understand the state we're trying to attain, that it's good to keep in mind that it's a major process to get to that really top level. And that's not to say that a person who is having these transformative experiences cannot become more creative, cannot be happier, cannot be more wise, but that final stage where we are living in this 24 hours a day, it's a huge jump. So I hope that answers your question.
One way of addressing skeptics who think we've really attained the highest level of evolution is to ask them, well, how do you account for the fact that we've evolved from one-celled animals to where we are today? And do you think, given that experience, that somehow we've reached the peak, that we will evolve no further? And they can begin to relate to that. Because if you look at it logically, all the questions that Linda raised at the beginning of the presentation on all the things that were wrong with human nature, that were the negative qualities that have been so destructive: financial collapse, war, greed, illness, addiction, sexual slavery, racial hatred. Those all go away if we evolve into bodiless beings, which, I mean, the body has served a purpose through evolution to master certain elements of the physical world. But who's to say that we won't ultimately evolve into bodiless beings where all those problems that I just mentioned will fall away of their own accord?
Interesting. Very interesting. Last question, and I think this is a really great question and kind of hinting off the same thing you just touched on, JJ. It's from Ethan Bach. It says, Corinne et al. During these times, especially since the new president-elect, many people are deeply impacted, triggered, depressed, angry, etc. My initial reaction is to want to retract. How can we acknowledge their experience and provide direction without getting sucked in their experience? Some people are intense. So does anyone want to start?
Go, Corinne.
I actually don't have a good answer for that, aside from, reminding people, or just actually sharing my own point of view, which is we're exactly where we're supposed to be at. Everything is as it should be at the moment. And we can take what is there and just do our best with what's presented to us, but to add to the harmony rather than the disharmony. And however you find a way to add to the harmony of what's happening, that is, to me, love and compassion. That's how love and compassion can be extended into that's all I have to say on it.
I have a little bit of feedback on that, and Ethan is right that people are confused, angry. There's a lot of disarray happening right now, and in people's minds, and I think across the world. One thing that comes to mind is that we have this idea. There's this concept of locus of control, and it basically is where you feel the control in your life is coming from. So, do you have control of your life, or are other external forces working to sort of control your life, overpower you, get you in a little box? And I think that's all just a shift of perspective. It's a shift of attitude. So when we were getting this event together, I mentioned to the group that if we do nothing but lift people out of that mindset, even for just a few short hours, we've done a great service to the world. And I hope that after this conference, that all of us, both the presenters and also the audience, take that attitude and take that mindset and understand that there are things that you can do in the world. I think every single speaker has mentioned at least a few things that you can take back and do in your daily life to end up impacting things positively. And if you take that attitude, that you are the one who decides, you are the one who is in control, and you are the one who is ultimately responsible and accountable, then you can take that attitude forward in life and help spread it to other people, so that it removes that confusion, it removes that disarray, because they know that they themselves have the power to act, have the power to do everything, to change the world. And you saw that in the presidential election. A lot of people just kind of threw up their hands. And now we're living with the fact that a lot of people just didn't feel like they were in control, or that they were responsible or accountable for the decision that the United States has made in terms of its president-elect. So changing that attitude, Kundalini, I think, offers a really potent avenue for that transformation and for that shift in attitude. Because now what we're saying is, if you want to change the world, you first change yourself. And here is the mechanism, here are the tools to enable you to do that. And you first change yourself. Once you've achieved a certain level of transformation, you will be called to then serve the world, once you are able to stabilize or balance, in the appropriate way.
Thank you. Another thing I would like to add is build community. Get together with people. I know there's a lot of no DAPL protesters out there who are very like-minded, standing up for Mother Earth. Community like that. Get with a group who's actively trying to change things now. Also get to know yourself very well. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for more questions, yet there was still more questions pouring in. The last thing, though, people wanted to know where to find you guys. So I will ask Mike if he can post links to your respective websites on the video. Then we are good. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.